You truly think the borders will hold you, Ophelia? Cassian's voice wasn't a shout. It was the grinding of stone against stone, heavy with the terrifying promise of silence. Ophelia didn't turn. She clutched the rough, coarse wool of her travel cloak, her knuckles white, refusing to let him see the tremor that threatened to break her composure. "The borders are the least of my concerns, my king," she whispered, her voice fragile yet steady as winter ice. "She is carrying my heir, Ophelia. Do you imagine I will let you vanish while the court prepares for a coronation?" She finally faced him, her eyes wide, haunted by the ghost of the woman who had once believed his promises. "I don't imagine, Cassian. I hope. There is a difference." She stepped into the dark. The castle of Ethelgard did not just stand. It loomed. It was a monolith of basalt and malice, perched on a jagged precipice that seemed to bite into the gray, roiling sky. Inside its walls, the air always tasted of cold stone and old secrets. Ophelia moved through the servants' corridor, her footsteps muted by the thick tapestry of shadows that draped the hallways. She was not a servant, though she wore their drab, homespun gray. She was, or had been, the heart of the court, the quiet melody in the king's brutal symphony. Now she was merely a ghost in her own home. The news had reached her 3 days ago, delivered not by a herald, but by the devastating sight of Lady Isolde, the daughter of a rival duke, walking the gardens with her hand resting proudly upon her stomach. A swell of fabric, a secret made visible. The court had practically vibrated with the gossip. The king's heir. The future secured, and in that moment, the vision of the life Ophelia had built with Cassian, a life constructed of whispered promises in the library and stolen glances during state dinners, shattered like glass on a hearthstone. She realized then that she had been a diversion, a beautiful ornament, while the king's true ambitions were forged elsewhere. Ophelia reached the postern gate, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She paused, pulling a small silver locket from beneath her collar. It was the only thing she had left of her father's estate, a place burned to the ground by Cassian's own banners before he had graciously taken her under his protection. The irony was a jagged blade in her gut. She had been living in the den of the wolf who had devoured her past. A guard stood at the gate, his armor catching the dull moonlight. He was young, a boy who had likely never seen blood spilled in earnest. Ophelia tightened her grip on her cloak. She knew his name, Ewan. He had often shared his meager rations with the castle cats. He was kind. Kindness was a weakness in Ethelgard, and it was her only hope. "Lady Ophelia?" Ewan's voice cracked. He recognized her, despite the disguise. He looked behind him, his eyes wide with fear. "You shouldn't be here. The king. He has posted watchers at every gate. He's looking for everyone who was in the western wing tonight." "He isn't looking for everyone, Ewan," she said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent murmur. She stepped closer, invading his space just enough to command his focus. "He's looking for me, and if he finds me, he will destroy everything I touch, including you for letting me pass." The boy paled. "He'll have my head. If you let me stay, he will have your soul," Ophelia countered, leaning into the lie with a conviction she didn't feel. "Which do you value more?" She didn't wait for his answer. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy gold signet ring, a token Cassian had given her during the first winter, a symbol of his favor that she had kept in secret. She pressed it into Ewan's palm. "I'd take this to the market in the valley. Sell it. Get out of this kingdom. Do not come back." Ewan looked at the gold, then at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, the same terror he felt whenever the king walked the halls. He stepped aside, his hand trembling as he unlatched the heavy iron bolt. The sound of the gate groaning open was the loudest noise Ophelia had ever heard. She slipped through, the cold night air biting at her cheeks like a physical blow. She didn't look back at the walls of Ethelgard. She didn't dare. To look back was to invite the memory of Cassian's touch, his possessive gaze, and the crushing weight of the life he had forced upon her. She ran. Into the woods, into the dark, into the terrifying uncertainty of a world that no longer had a king to command her, but one that held an alpha who would never let his property go. The forest did not welcome her. It was a suffocating tapestry of ancient oaks and thorny underbrush that clawed at her gray woolen cloak as if trying to tear the secret of her flight from her shoulders. The air grew thinner the further she climbed, the altitude making her breath hitch in sharp, jagged gasps. Ophelia didn't stop. Her boots, thin-soled and unsuited for the mountain terrain, were already soaking through with the icy slush of early spring. She wasn't merely running away, she was unspooling. Every step took her further from the woman she had been in the palace, the one who measured her worth by the curve of Cassian's smile, the one who believed that silence was a virtue in a court of vipers. She found refuge in a hollowed-out tree trunk, a rotted titan of the woods that smelled of damp earth and decay. It was small, tight, and suffocating, yet it was the safest place she had found in years. As she curled into a ball, trying to stop the shivering that racked her frame, a memory surfaced, unbidden, like a dark spring bubbling through sand. He had placed the heavy gold necklace around her throat, his fingers grazing her skin with a possessiveness that had felt, at the time, like adoration. "You belong to the crown, Ophelia," he had murmured, his voice a low vibration against her ear. "And the crown belongs to me." She had thought it was a vow of eternal care. Now she realized it was a branding. Ophelia pressed her palms against her eyes, willing the image away. She needed to focus on the terrain. She was heading toward the border of Oakhaven, a neutral territory that paid no tribute to Ethelgard. If she could reach the river, she could board a merchant skiff, but the forest was quiet. Too quiet. In the distance, the rhythmic, heavy thud of a horse's gallop broke the silence. It wasn't the frantic trot of a rider in haste, but the methodical, predatory pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Cassian. He wasn't searching, he was tracking. She had made a mistake. She had been so focused on getting out of the palace that she hadn't considered the way he studied her. He knew how she walked when she was afraid. He knew that she always favored the high ground, even when it was harder to climb, because she needed to see the horizon. She had been predictable. A snap of a twig echoed nearby. Ophelia froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She held her breath until her lungs burned. Through the gaps in the wood, she saw a flicker of torchlight. It was one of the king's hounds, a soldier clad in the obsidian armor of the elite guard. He stopped near her hiding spot, his helmeted head tilting to the side, listening. He had stopped not because he saw her, but because the wind had shifted, carrying her scent. He's hunting with men, she realized, her pulse spiking. He's not even coming for me himself yet. He's letting his dogs tire me out. She didn't dare move. She watched as the guard reached into his belt and pulled out a small, jagged piece of metal, a broken piece of the locket she had left behind in the postern gate. He didn't just have orders, he had a trail. As the guard moved on, Ophelia realized the terrifying reality of her situation. She wasn't just running from a man, she was running from an institution. The entire kingdom was an extension of Cassian's will. To cross the border, she would need more than luck. She would need to become the very thing she had tried to leave behind, a creature as ruthless as the king himself. She crawled out of the hollow tree, her movements fluid and silent, the terror in her gut hardening into a cold, sharp resolve. She had to lead them away from the road. She had to lure them into the treacherous marshes of the Blackwater. If she couldn't outrun them, she would have to break them. The Blackwater marshes were not a place where men went to live. They were a place where the kingdom discarded its sins. The air here was heavy, thick with the scent of rotting vegetation and stagnant water, a stark contrast to the crisp, pine-scented needles of the highland forest. Ophelia's lungs burned, not just from the exertion of her flight, but from the noxious miasma rising from the earth. She waded into the muck, the water rising past her ankles, then her knees, pulling at her boots like the grasping hands of the dead. She remembered her father's warnings about the Blackwater. The land is as treacherous as a politician's smile, Ophelia. It looks solid, but beneath the surface it swallows everything whole. He had been right. It was the perfect place to bury a secret. Or, as she intended, a hunter. Behind her, the sounds of the pursuit grew louder. The rhythmic clatter of armor against leather, the splashing of horses slowing as they reached the soft, treacherous bank. They were close. Too close. She could hear the rough, gravelly voice of the captain of the hounds, a man known only as Kalen. "She's heading for the mire," Kalen barked, his voice echoing over the reeds. "Dismount. If you ride into the deep, you'll lose your mounts. We hunt on foot." Ophelia crouched behind a dense thicket of black willow, her breath ragged. She wasn't merely hiding, she was waiting. Her fingers brushed against a heavy, jagged rock she had pulled from the bank. It wasn't a weapon for war, but in the soft, unstable terrain of the marsh, weight was the enemy. She watched through a gap in the foliage as 3 figures emerged from the tree line. They were draped in the heavy, dark cloaks of the King's Guard, their faces obscured by the shadow of their helmets. They were elite, disciplined, and utterly relentless. She took a breath, forcing her heart to slow. Think like him, she told herself, the thought of Cassian invading her mind like a poison. How would he hunt me? He would rely on his strength. He would rely on the certainty that his prey was weaker, slower, and paralyzed by fear. She let out a sharp, piercing whistle, the sound of a distressed bird, and then splashed heavily into the water to her left, making sure they would hear the disruption. "There!" a voice shouted. The heavy thud of boots hitting the water followed. They were taking the bait. They charged forward, armor rattling, their focus fixed entirely on the movement in the reeds. They didn't see her. They didn't see the way she had intentionally skirted the edge of the deeper silt pits, leaving a trail that looked like a hasty, panicked flight. As the guards surged toward the sound she had fabricated, Ophelia slipped silently into the water on the opposite side. She moved with a liquid grace she hadn't known she possessed, her body reacting to the terrain with a survivalist's instinct. She reached the first of the guards, a soldier who had fallen slightly behind the others. He didn't hear her until it was too late. Ophelia didn't hesitate. She didn't offer a warning or a plea. She shoved him with every ounce of strength she possessed. A sudden, violent burst of force aimed at his center of gravity as he stepped onto a patch of deceptive, shimmering silt. He didn't sink immediately, but the instability sent him flailing. His arms windmilled, his armor clanking loudly, and he tipped backward. As he struggled to find footing, he sank up to his waist in the thick, suffocating sludge. "Help!" he gurgled, the sound quickly silenced as the silt pulled him deeper. The other 2 guards stopped, their heads whipping around. Panic flared in the air, not for her, but for their comrade. They were trained for battle, for swordplay, and for loyalty. They were not trained for the hungry, uncaring earth of the Blackwater. Ophelia melted back into the shadows of the willow trees, her hands trembling. She had done it. She had neutralized one of them, but she had also revealed her presence. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a threat. And as she crept further into the heart of the marsh, she knew that Kaelin wouldn't be fooled by the same trick twice. The hunt had just changed. It was no longer about catching her. It was about eliminating her before she could reach the border. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the frantic rhythm of her heart. She was terrified. Yes. But beneath that terror, there was something else. A cold, sharp hunger for survival that felt dangerously, exhilaratingly like power. The rain began as a whisper, then turned into a steady gray curtain that washed the world in shades of slate and misery. Ophelia stumbled onto solid ground, her boots caked in the foul, clinging mud of the Blackwater. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, a symphony of aches that reminded her she was still alive, still breathing, still fighting. She collapsed under the eaves of a gnarled oak, pulling her soaked cloak tighter. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the mire was leaching away, leaving behind a hollow, shivering void. Her hands, still stained with the dark silt of the marsh, were trembling uncontrollably. She had done it. She had neutralized a threat. But the image of the soldier sinking into the silt, his eyes widening with that final, suffocating realization, refused to leave her mind. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the darkness behind her lids was worse. It was filled with Cassian's voice. Not the man she had loved, but the king who had molded her. "Mercy is a luxury for those who do not have to lead, Ophelia," he had said once, tracing the line of her jaw with a thumb that felt both protective and restrictive. "If you are ever in a position where you must choose between your life and another's, never choose the burden of regret. Regret is heavy. It will slow you down." She had wept for a trapped rabbit during a hunt once. He had comforted her, promised her that nature was cruel, and that they, the apex of this world, were simply its stewards. How easily he had twisted her empathy into a cage, making her believe that her softness was a weakness she needed him to buffer. Now, shivering in the freezing rain, she realized the truth. Her softness wasn't the weakness. His cruelty was. And by forcing her to survive in the wild, he hadn't broken her. He had stripped away the layers of pretense he had built around her. A sharp, familiar sound cut through the rain. The low, vibrating bay of a hound. Ophelia's eyes snapped open. They were still coming. The marsh had delayed them, not stopped them. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs feeling like leaden weights. She couldn't stay here. She needed to reach the high pass before nightfall, where the treacherous mountain trails would make it impossible for horses to follow. As she forced herself to move, she caught a reflection of herself in a puddle. She looked like a stranger. The delicate, court-bred lady was gone. In her place was a woman with wild, matted hair, eyes that burned with a feverish, cold light, and the gait of someone who had learned to walk without leaving a path. Miles away, standing at the edge of the very marsh Ophelia had crossed, Cassian looked down at the site of the skirmish. The silt had been disturbed, a clear sign of a struggle. One of his hounds, the one who had plunged into the pit, was being pulled from the mud by his comrades, gasping and shivering, his armor ruined. Cassian didn't look at the soldier. His gaze was fixed on the reeds where Ophelia had hidden. He knelt, his gloved fingers brushing against a patch of broken willow branches. He could smell her, damp wool, pine, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. But there was something else, too. Something he hadn't expected. He picked up a small, smooth riverstone she had dropped. It was marked with a crude, jagged scratch, a symbol he recognized. It was a hunting mark, one he had taught her when they had played at games of skill in the summer gardens. He stood, a slow, dangerous smile touching his lips. It wasn't the smile of a spurned lover. It was the look of a strategist who had realized his opponent had finally learned the rules of the board. "She's not running away," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. "My king?" Kalen approached, his armor rattling. Cassian turned, his eyes dark and unreadable. "She is leading us. She knows this terrain better than she lets on. Or perhaps," he paused, glancing back at the path she had taken. "She is finally becoming the woman I always knew she could be." He didn't sound angry. He sounded proud. And that, to Ophelia, would have been the most terrifying realization of all. The game had changed. He wasn't just hunting a traitor anymore. He was chasing a ghost of himself, a reflection of his own ambition, and he found the pursuit intoxicating. "Continue the chase," Cassian commanded, his voice sharp as a blade. "But do not kill her. I want to see how far she can go before she realizes that the only place she can truly hide is in my arms." The world had narrowed to the rhythm of her own labored breath, a ragged whistling sound that tore through the frigid silence of the mountain pass. The high pass was not merely a geographic location. It was a vertical tomb waiting to claim the unprepared. Ophelia's fingers, numbed by the frost, clawed at the jagged granite, seeking purchase where there was none. Every muscle in her body felt as though it had been flayed and reassembled by a novice butcher. She was no longer Ophelia, the ornament of Ethelgard. She was a singular, driven force of kinetic desperation. The cold was a physical weight, a mantle of ice that pressed against her chest, slowing her heartbeat to a sluggish, dangerous tempo. She paused, pressing her forehead against the icy stone. The wind howled, a mournful, high-pitched scream that mimicked the agony in her own marrow. For a fleeting second, her mind drifted back to the palace, to the roaring hearths of the great hall, the warmth of spiced wine, and the silk-lined comfort of her chambers. She remembered Cassian's voice, a velvet promise of security. "Oh, you are a delicate flower, Ophelia," he had once told her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "It is the duty of the gardener to ensure you never have to face the storm." She laughed, a harsh, hacking sound that died instantly in the biting air. He hadn't been protecting her. He had been pruning her. He had systematically removed the thorns of her intuition, the roots of her autonomy, until she was nothing more than a bloom waiting to wither when he decided to stop watering her. She pulled herself over the lip of the ridge, her boots skidding on a patch of black ice. She fell hard, the impact jarring her teeth. A cry escaped her, but she stifled it, clamping her hand over her mouth. Silence was her only ally. She looked back down the trail she had ascended. Miles below, the Blackwater Marsh was a mere smudge of dark gray on the horizon. They were still there. She could feel the predatory focus of the king's hounds, not through sight, but through a primal, heightened awareness that terrified her. She was leaving a trail of exhaustion, a breadcrumb path of shivers and stolen moments of rest. She stood, shivering violently, and forced herself to walk. The path narrowed, hugging the cliffside until it was no wider than a sword's length. Below, the abyss yawned, a silent promise of eternal rest. As she navigated the treacherous ledge, she spotted a small, sheltered alcove beneath a rocky overhang. It wasn't luxury, it was a crevice. but it was dry. She huddled inside, curling into the fetal position, her cloak offering little defense against the encroaching frost. As she drifted into a fitful, shallow sleep, the memory of her father's estate burned in her mind. She remembered the fire. She remembered the heat of it, the way it had tasted like ash and betrayal. She had been naive then, thinking that safety was a gift given by the powerful. Now she knew that safety was a commodity that had to be carved out of the world with one's own hands, often at the expense of one's own humanity. Miles beneath her, the search party had slowed. Cassian walked the path himself, his boots crunching on the frozen earth. He didn't look tired. He looked invigorated. She went up, Kalen noted, his voice strained by the exertion of the climb. It's a death trap, my king. No one takes the high pass in the spring. The thaw hasn't even begun. The avalanches. Cassian held up a hand, silencing him. He knelt, his eyes scanning the ground. There, caught on a sharp outcropping of rock, was a strip of gray wool, a fragment of her cloak. He picked it up, the fabric feeling coarse and common between his gloved fingers. He didn't burn it. He didn't discard it. He tucked it into his tunic near his heart. She is not trying to find safety, Kalen, Cassian said, his voice low, vibrating with a strange, dark intensity. She is trying to transcend her own limits. She knows the danger. She knows the risk of the avalanche. Then she is committing suicide, Kalen countered. Cassian looked up toward the towering, snow-dusted peaks. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. No. She is proving that she can survive without me. And the more she proves that, the more she belongs to me. Because only I will truly understand the cost of what she is doing. He motioned for the men to continue, his pace unhurried, almost leisurely. He wasn't afraid of losing her. He was watching a masterpiece being painted in real time, and he had no intention of interrupting the artist before the final stroke. "Now, do not rush her," he commanded, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying, absolute confidence. Let her climb until her fingers bleed. Let her realize the height of the precipice. And then, when she is at her most exhausted, when she realizes that the only thing holding her up is her own will, that is when I will be there to catch her. The cold was no longer an adversary. It was a companion. Ophelia had ceased fighting the frost that gnawed at her fingertips, and instead integrated it into the rhythm of her movement. She rose from the alcove, her limbs stiff, creaking like old timber. The mountain air was thin, tasting of nothing but ice and ancient rock. She had to keep moving. The ridge was a narrow spine of stone, dropping away into a dizzying white void on both sides. Every step required a calculation of physics she had never learned in the palace libraries. Center of gravity, breath control, grip. A memory flashed. The dance hall at Ethelgard, the smooth, polished marble floors, the scent of lavender and expensive wax, and Cassian's hand on the small of her back, guiding her through the intricate, formal steps of a quadrille. She had been a doll on a music box, moving only when prompted, stopping when the music ceased. She shoved the image aside. That girl was dead. If she tried to move with that grace now, she would tumble to her death. She reached a section of the path where the stone had crumbled away, leaving a gap of 10 feet. A jump, or a certain end. Below, the abyss was a silent, gaping maw. She looked down, felt the vertigo threaten to pull her over, and immediately looked up at the peaks. She didn't pray to the gods of Ethelgard. She didn't pray at all. She took a breath, the air burning her lungs, and leapt. Her boots skidded on the far edge. She scrambled, her fingernails tearing against the rough, frozen grit. She dangled there for a heart-stopping moment, legs kicking at empty space, until she hauled herself up, sobbing with the sheer, agonizing effort. She lay on her back, staring at the gray, indifferent sky, and for the first time, she laughed. It was a jagged, broken sound, but it was real. She had survived. Miles below, the path was choked with the debris of the mountain. Cassian stood at the base of the broken ridge, his eyes tracing the path upward. She jumped it, my king," Kaelin whispered, awe leaking into his voice. "The crossing at the Needle's Eye. No one in their right mind attempts that without ropes. The stone is brittle." Cassian did not look at the ledge. He looked at the snow, where Ophelia's desperate, frantic scramble had left marks. He knelt, tracing the indentations with his gloved hand. He could see her struggle. He could see the terror. But he also saw the outcome. She had made it across. "She is not in her right mind, Kaelin," Cassian said, his voice strangely soft. "She is in a state of absolute necessity. Do you see this?" He pointed to the marks. She didn't hesitate. She didn't calculate the risk. She simply decided that the drop was less dangerous than staying behind. He stood, his gaze hardening as he surveyed the treacherous ascent. "She is being remade by the mountain. Every inch she climbs, she is shedding the courtly silk I wrapped her in. It's fascinating, is it not? It's dangerous," Kaelin countered, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "If we push her too hard, she won't just fall. She will trigger the slide. The snow is unstable. One more step and the whole shelf could go." Cassian looked up toward the summit, his eyes gleaming with a dark, terrifying hunger. "Then let it slide. Let the mountain try to break her. If she survives the avalanche, she will have transcended everything I ever taught her. And if she doesn't, then at least she died free, rather than as an ornament in my hall." He gestured for the men to hold back. He wouldn't follow her closely anymore. He would watch from a distance, savoring the spectacle of her transformation. He wasn't just hunting her anymore. He was witnessing the birth of a creature he had long fantasized about. A woman as cold, as jagged, and as lethal as the winter itself. "Wait here," Cassian commanded, his gaze never leaving the heights. "She has one more lesson to learn before I claim her. She needs to understand that no matter how high she climbs, the air remains mine to breathe. The wind on the summit of the high pass did not blow. It struck. It was a physical blow, a rhythmic hammering of ice and grit against the stone, designed to erode everything that stood against it. Ophelia had crawled beyond the point of human endurance, her body functioning on a reserve of energy she didn't know she possessed. Her hands were no longer numb. They were burning, a dull, throbbing fire beneath layers of frost. She found shelter not in a cave, but in the ruins of a stone watchtower that predated the kingdom of Ethelgard. It was a hollowed-out shell, a circular wall of gray masonry that offered a reprieve from the gale. She collapsed inside, her back against the ancient, lichen-covered stone. The silence here was profound, not empty, but heavy. It felt like the world was holding its breath. Ophelia closed her eyes, and for the first time in days, the voice of the king was absent. The phantom rhythm of the quadrille, the scent of lavender and wax, the suffocating warmth of the palace. It was all gone, scoured away by the relentless air. She opened her eyes and looked at her hands. They were raw, bleeding, and trembling, but they were hers. They belonged to no one. She realized with a sudden jagged clarity that the terrifying thing about her freedom wasn't the danger. It was the weight of it. There was no one to blame for her next step, no one to thank for her survival, and no one to hold her when the night grew too cold. She was entirely, dangerously autonomous. She reached into her tunic and pulled out the small piece of gray wool she had kept, the last shred of the life she had once woven for herself. She looked at it for a long moment, then dropped it into the small pile of dry scrub she had gathered for a fire. She didn't light it. She just let the scrap sit there, a relic of a ghost. "I am not going back," she whispered. The sound was thin, swallowed by the stone walls, but it felt like a declaration of war. Miles down the trail, the mountain was less forgiving to the hunters. Cassian sat on a flat rock, his breathing heavy and ragged. For the first time in years, the iron-willed king looked exhausted. His armor, usually a symbol of invincibility, felt like a leaden coffin. His men were huddled nearby, their morale fracturing under the weight of the altitude and the unrelenting, hostile landscape. Kalen knelt beside him, checking the straps of his gauntlet. "We should turn back, my king. The air is too thin. Even the hounds are faltering. If we push further, we lose the men." Cassian didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the spire of the watchtower, a tiny, jagged tooth against the bruising purple of the evening sky. He was staring at the place where she had vanished from sight. "She is up there," Cassian said, his voice barely a rasp. "She is sitting in those ruins, Kalen. She is freezing. She is bleeding. And she is closer to the truth than she has ever been. She is dying," Kalen argued, his voice sharp with desperation. "She has no supplies, no fire. She will be a frozen statue by dawn." Cassian finally looked at him, and the dark hunger in his eyes had been replaced by a flickering shadow of doubt. It wasn't pity. It was a realization that he had underestimated the cost of the game. He had wanted her to be strong, yes, a worthy queen for a man who ruled with iron. But he had never intended for her to be gone. He stood, his knees cracking, his body protesting the cold. He looked at the mountain, and for the first time, he realized that it was not his subject. It was a wild, indifferent force that didn't care about his lineage or his power. "If she dies," Cassian said, his tone turning cold. "She dies as a free woman. But she will not die. She is too spiteful for that." He pointed upward, his hand shaking slightly, not from the cold, but from a surge of adrenaline. "We climb at first light. We do not stop. If the mountain wants to take her, it will have to fight me for her." He retreated to his small, silk-lined tent, but he did not sleep. He sat in the darkness, clutching the hilt of his sword, listening to the wind howl, a sound that, for the first time, reminded him of her scream. He was no longer the hunter chasing a stray bird. He was a man realizing that he had driven his prize to a height he could no longer reach. The storm did not announce itself with clouds or warnings. It simply arrived, a wall of white that erased the world. Ophelia was already moving. The watchtower had given her the clarity she needed, but it offered no food, and the cold was relentless. She stepped out into the gale, her movements jerky and stiff, like a marionette with tangled strings. She had no destination, only a direction. Away. Away from the palace. Away from the memory of lavender and wax, and away from the man who was currently trying to climb the mountain of her defiance. She found the path down, a narrow, treacherous chute of shale that demanded everything she had. She was no longer running from Cassian. She was running for her own life, a distinction that felt monumental. Above the roar of the wind, she heard a sound that didn't belong to the mountain, a sharp, percussive crack. It was the sound of earth giving way. Miles below, Cassian had stopped. He was looking at the flank of the mountain, his hand frozen in midair as he pointed to a root. "The shelf is unstable," Kalen shouted over the howl of the gale, his voice thick with uncharacteristic fear. "My king, the pressure is too great. The snow is packed too tight. We have to fall back to the tree line." Cassian didn't listen. He was staring at the summit, his eyes wide and unblinking. He saw a movement, a speck of gray against the blinding white. Ophelia. She was descending, unburdened by the vanity of her former life, moving with a desperate, jerky speed. "She's crossing the fault," Cassian whispered, his voice caught between admiration and horror. "The fault!" Kalen grabbed Cassian's shoulder, shaking him. "If she steps on that ridge, the vibration alone will trigger the slide. We'll be buried. We have to move now." Cassian finally turned to look at his captain, and for the first time in his reign, he looked small. The Alpha, the man who commanded the tides of war and the flow of court politics, was suddenly confronted with a power he could not coerce. The mountain didn't care about his title. It didn't care about his lineage. It didn't care about his heir. "And if she dies," Cassian said, his voice flat, "then it was her choice." "She isn't choosing to die," Kalen roared, shoving him. "She's trying to survive. You are the one who is killing her." The truth hit Cassian like a physical blow to the chest. He looked back at the mountain. The sky was bruising, purple and black, and the air was thick with the scent of ozone and impending destruction. He saw the shift, a tremor in the snowpack. The avalanche didn't start with a roar. It started with a whisper of shifting ice, followed by a sudden terrifying groan of the mountain itself. Then, the world began to move. Cassian watched, paralyzed, as the ledge where Ophelia had been standing simply vanished. It poured downward, a massive, grinding river of white and gray, devouring everything in its path. "She's gone," Kalen breathed, backing away. Cassian didn't back away. He stood rooted to the spot, his hand reaching out as if he could catch the slide with his bare fingers. The sound was deafening, a roar that drowned out his thoughts, his ambitions, and the cold, hard logic of his rule. He watched the massive tide of debris rush toward the valley, covering the path he had intended to follow. He didn't see a victory. He didn't see a test passed. He saw a void. He fell to his knees, his armor scraping against the rock. The silence that followed the avalanche was more terrifying than the roar. It was the silence of a kingdom without a queen, a life without a center. "Search," he commanded, his voice sounding brittle and hollow. "Find her." But even as he spoke, he knew the futility of it. He had wanted to break her to his will, to mold her into the perfect partner for his ironclad rule. In doing so, he had triggered the very thing he claimed to despise, a force of nature that refused to be contained. He looked at his own hands, the hands that had held the power to grant favors and execute treason, and he saw only the emptiness of his own creation. He had wanted an equal, but he had feared the strength required to stand beside him. Now, he feared that he had simply destroyed the only person who had ever truly seen him. The shattered crown title refers to the cracks in his own identity. He is no longer the invincible king, but a man who has lost his purpose to the very wild he sought to conquer. I hope this chapter effectively dismantles Cassian's ego. The weight of the avalanche, both physical and metaphorical, leaves him in a very vulnerable place. Let me know when you are ready to conclude the story with the final chapter. The silence after the slide was absolute. The mountain, having claimed the ledge, seemed to fall back into a state of indifference. Cassian remained on his knees for hours, the frost creeping up the joints of his greaves. His men had formed a perimeter, their eyes cast downward, fearful of interrupting the king's descent into a madness that was as quiet as the snow. "My king," Kalen finally ventured, his voice cracking. "The sun is setting. If we remain, the temperature will drop below what any man can endure. We must go." Cassian didn't respond. He was staring at the scar in the landscape, the fresh gash of white where the mountain had stripped itself bare. He had come here to break her, to prove that he could capture the wind and cage the storm. Now, looking at the void, he realized he had only succeeded in breaking himself. He stood, his movements stiff and ancient. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had signed death warrants and caressed Ophelia's face. They felt like tools of a dead man. "Oh, we do not leave," Cassian said, his voice devoid of its usual authority. It was thin, frayed at the edges. "We search until the thaw, every inch, every stone, but deep down, in the marrow of his bones, he knew. The avalanche hadn't taken a prisoner. It had taken a secret. Ophelia had not been crushed beneath the weight of the snow. She had vanished into the logic of the wild, a place where his titles and his armies meant nothing. The weeks that followed were a blur of hollow motions. Cassian returned to Ethelgard, but the palace felt like a crypt. The throne, once his seat of absolute power, felt like a cold, uncomfortable chair. The scent of lavender and wax, once his reminder of Ophelia's presence, had been replaced by the smell of stagnant ash and dying dreams. The mistress, Isolde, remained, a reminder of his tactical blunder. She spoke to him of heirs and alliances, but her voice was a dull drone that barely penetrated his awareness. He didn't hate her, nor did he love her. He simply didn't see her. He saw only the mountain. One evening, he sat in the library, the very room where he had once lectured Ophelia on the nature of control. He pulled a volume from the shelf and found, tucked within the pages, a small, pressed flower she had left behind, a forgotten relic of her past self. He didn't burn it. He couldn't. He realized then that he hadn't lost her to the mountain. He had lost her long before they had ever reached the high pass. He had lost her the moment he decided that her value lay in her submission. She hadn't been fleeing from the avalanche. She had been fleeing from the version of herself he had insisted she become. In the distance, far beyond the reach of his riders and his spies, in a valley that did not feature on any of his maps, a woman walked. Her hair was sun-bleached and tangled. Her hands were scarred and calloused, and her eyes held the sharpness of a hawk. She wore no crown, no silk, and no chains. She stopped by a river, watching the water rush over smooth stones. She didn't look back at the horizon, for there was nothing left to return to. She was not waiting to be found. She was simply living. Cassian stared at the pressed flower in his hand, the brittle petals disintegrating under his touch. He was the king of Ethelgard, the alpha of the realm, the man who had command over thousands. Yet, as he sat in the dark of his silent library, he realized he was the poorest man in his kingdom. He had hunted for a queen, and in his arrogance, he had ensured that he would forever be a king of nothing but his own regret. A year had passed since the mountain claimed the ledge, and the seasons in the valley had turned with a quiet, indifferent grace. The winter snows had melted, feeding the rivers that carved their way through the jagged landscape, and the spring blooms were once again painting the hills in vibrant hues of gold and violet. In this hidden valley, far removed from the cold stone walls of Ethelgard, a woman walked. Her steps were sure, her body lean and hardened by the labor of her own survival. She paused by the river, her hair caught in the breeze, the sun-bleached strands loose and wild. She wore simple homespun clothes, stitched with care, and her hands were no longer the soft, pale instruments of a courtly life. They were scarred, calloused, and capable. She was not the Queen of Aethelgard. She was not the ornament of the king's hall. She was simply Ophelia, and she was enough. She looked toward the distant ridge where the peaks of the high pass still scraped the sky. A silhouette appeared on the horizon. A rider, small and solitary, paused against the light. She knew, with a sudden calm clarity, that it was a scout from the capital. Perhaps the king still sent them, or perhaps it was mere habit. She didn't hide. She stood still, watching the figure. The rider remained for a long moment, scanning the vast, sprawling expanse of the valley. But the mountains here were deceptive, their shadows deep and their paths intricate. To anyone looking for a queen, there was nothing to see. There was only the wind, the river, and the vast, beautiful expanse of a life truly lived. The rider turned his horse and vanished back into the clouds. Ophelia turned away from the horizon. She had nothing to fear from the return of the past. The kingdom was a world away, a dream she had dreamt and then forgotten upon waking. She walked back toward her small cabin, the smoke curling from its chimney, a testament to a hearth she had built herself. She did not wait for approval. She did not seek a crown. She was the architect of her own solitude, the sovereign of her own silence. And in that, she had found a throne that no man could ever take from her. This epilogue offers closure by showing that Ophelia has not only survived, but thrived. The king's scout represents the final lingering attachment to her past life, which she dismisses with apathy. The focus is on her agency. She isn't running anymore. She is simply living, which is the ultimate victory over a man who sought to define her existence.